Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept. And if you're interested in becoming a member, you're welcome to do so, and you can find out more information on our website. In this session, we welcome Dr. Rahmat Shazi for a session titled Social Capital Matters, Industry Perspectives. Rahmat is currently the Technology Director of Shaz Innovation Solutions, as well as a member of the board of Combat Advanced Meditech. Through his PhD on innovation management, he is an expert on the application of social capital for risk assessment, trust management, leveraging on social capital models, and commercialization of innovations. He's had 25 years of prior experience in Petronas, as well as consulting work in Australia. Currently, he is on an industry advisory panel of 10 universities, both Malaysian and international, and he's actively applying the concept of social capital in his work with industry. So we're delighted that you've agreed to give this webinar, and welcome, Rahmat, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. We appreciate the opportunity that's given. Before I move any further, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Tristan for actually holding the fort and being the rock that anchors all of us, because all of us are going in all sorts of directions. You have definitions of social capital, but if it hadn't been for Tristan telling everyone, okay, this is the direction we're going, I don't think we'll get here. Thank you so much. So in any case, thank you so much to those of you who are watching either live or the recorded version that will be uploaded to YouTube. My name is Rahmat, as Tristan mentioned, and I fell to social capital by accident, to be perfectly frank. Prior to my PhD, I was actually a mechanical engineering lecturer and researcher, so I had no inkling whatsoever about sociology, psychology, until I realized that for innovation management, at the time I was still with Petronas, we discovered that there's a lot of focus on technology, but very little on the application of technology for sociology. And it got me thinking and very, very interested in that aspect of both research and application. So I pursued a PhD over at the University of Queensland, which is just around the corner from where Tristan is. And it was amazing. It was amazing, the kind of things that sociologists have discovered, psychologists have discovered over the years. But there was a gap. There was a gap in actually converting all that knowledge, those findings, those intuitions, those nuances, into something that industries will find useful. They can actually make heads and tails of it, so that at the end of the day, social capital really plays a role of not merely being a capital per se, but really playing a major role in performance improvement. I did ask my supervisor at the time, why me? Because I'm not even I didn't even take a degree in sociology. And he said that we need, let me make sure I get the words right. We need a nerd like you to be able to convert all of this mumbo jumbo into something that technologists can make use of. So I thought, yes, I'm the nerd. I'm the nerd for that. So talking about social capital, you can see it on screen. Today we'll talk about social capital matters. Just a play on word. Does it matter? It does. We know that. We've heard a lot of speakers speak on this platform. We had Professor Lyndon Johnson, I believe, about 2 weeks ago, talking about structures that we know are associated with various aspects of social capital, their characteristics. But one of my supervisors over at the University of Queensland, Professor Tim Castell, always told me to ask the question, so what? Why does it matter? And I think as researchers, we've heard that question pop up many times. So today, I would like to actually share with you some of the things that make sense to industry, so that you would have a leg up later when you present your findings or you're trying to actually get it applied for a particular scenario, and should the question pop up, hopefully this hour or so will help you answer those questions. So moving on, hopefully everybody can hear me loud and clear and see the slides that are being shared, but do let us know if it's not coming through clearly. I like to use this particular slide because this was the input I got from a very prominent industry representative who said, Rahmat, social capital makes no sense to us. But if you are able to contextualize it using Lego blocks, I'll give you the time of day. So it took some time to put together a very basic visual, but when we got to this and we presented to them, they said, that makes sense to me. Right, come on over. I can now bring you to actually talk to the industry, to the board members, and actually say yes to the services that we offer. The challenge of actually converting our nuances as to what social capital is and how it differs to traditional approaches, especially in human resource, is where the International Social Capital Association can play a major role. Let's go in that direction. So getting back to the slides, magic when these Lego blocks come together. Without them, without them being connected, they are really individual pieces. And in a bit, I will actually highlight why this matters using some material that I actually, should I say, borrowed from the International Social Capital, rather the Institute of Social Capital website. Yes, so credit being given where it's due. For industry, though, what matters is, yes, cooperation is important, but is there a way to actually measure this? Is it real? Are there numbers? What does it mean? How can actually we leverage on that for better performance? Can we measure the resulting performance? And can we use the social capital measures to actually tell us whether we are going in the right direction? So today is story of how we were able to actually get a number of industry players, a number of them are multinationals, to actually say, yes, this makes sense to us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the next slides you'll see are actually definition, a collation. Collation, is that the right word? Collation of definitions of social capital that I believe the team under Tristan have spent so much time collating, and indicating what they are, arranging them in categories, external or bridging relationships, internal or a combination of both. What I want to focus on are the main or the core word that defines what these definitions are. For the external and for bridging relationship, we see words like resource, individuals, aggregate, sum. When it comes word aggregate, it implies that there is some way of putting a number to this or making heads or tail of the social capital elements that we typically hear. For example, relationships, trust. And a lot of people tend to say, oh, these are all intangibles. Well, 20 years ago, perhaps. But there's been a lot of advancement in the definition of these intangibles so that there is a way of measuring them. This is where we are at the cusp of being able to channel all these measures and help industry make sense of what's happening within and between the organizations. So these are the external definitions. These are the definitions for internal linking. We have words like the web, function, ability, culture, which comes about from historical relationships, expectations, features, voluntary means, and there are definitions that combines the two, right? Phrases like naturally occurring. By the way, when I actually post that definition to a number of industry partners or industry and potential clients, they balked at that. They asked the question, "What do you mean naturally occurring? These don't occur naturally. Are you implying that we have no control over this element of social capital? Get out of my office." Well, okay, not in so many words, but we understood what they meant. So this is the challenge that we face, trying to actually get the message across that social capital plays a critical role. And for a lot of them, top management have a sense of that particular value. It's just that the end of the day, they have to be answerable to the bean counters. So they need some numbers. They need to be answerable to the operations. They need to be answerable to various parts of the organization. So what we've done over in Malaysia is to look at some of the definitions, do the hard work and talk to multiple industry partners and ask them which one makes sense. One of the things we also did after that was to do a sort of a word cloud to actually look at all these definitions. And for a lot of the industry, it's the, let me make sure I get this right. It's the explanation of the difference between perception of what's possible and actual things that's happening on the ground. They need to see these separately. And just so happen, the definition or the model for trust has that. I'm not quite sure whether I have them in my slides, but if need be, I can always call it up and share with everybody how the trust model can really help glue things together for social capital. Of course, we can have other elements built on top of that, but we found that in a lot of organizations, the moment we say, hey, we can actually help you measure the trust and look at the channels of that trust, that's when they trust us. So moving on, the model that makes the most sense, or definition that made the most sense for a lot of the industry partners that we've spoken to as industry clients, including multinationals, UK organizations, even in Australia. For your information, we had a chance to actually work or deliver work for CSIRO in Australia. The model that you see on screen. Now, this one was the definition by Nahapiet and Ghoshal, which in turn was originally thought of by Putnam. So Nahapiet and Ghoshal took it further and looked at relational, cognitive, and structural elements. Now, in research parlance, that makes a lot of sense to a lot of us, but not to industry. So I would say I wouldn't say that we went on a trial and error approach, but we did have a lot of conversations with companies. And what made a lot of sense to them is if we are able to convey the message to them that social capital is an amalgamation rather than an aggregate amalgamation of soft skills, know-how, and know-who. Know-who is something that they have. They have the data regarding that. Know-how, yes, it's done usually during the assessment, the annual assessment. Soft skills, to a lot of the partners that we spoke to, that is a very ephemeral, a very intangible element. But when we showed to the people we spoke to that, hey, there is a way of capturing that, they loved it. And perhaps that's a similar approach that all of you can adopt. Again, social cap, this particular model isn't our intellectual property. It's available out there. But what is unique is a method or tools that we can use to amalgamate these measures. So what I would like to actually share with you today is that particular journey, or rather the output. I'll skip over this particular slide and give you a basic example. I typically use this because it's a very simple way of conveying the message of what social capital in a sense is, even though we are still at a social metric level, looking at just the networks. What you see on screen on the right is a typical business hierarchy. By the way, this is actually from a firm in Melbourne. You see, let me zoom in so that it's clearer. You see that the senior vice president of this exploration and production organization, Jones, is at the top, with the head of departments, Williams, Taylor, and Stock, the second tier, and then we have the other staff. Now, you see this arrow here pointing to a particular person. This is preempting a very interesting observation that we found when we started doing just the social metrics, just the social network analysis of these people. We discovered that Cole, who's relatively low on the hierarchy, is very central in the organization. And when we presented this to Jones, it suddenly clicked to him. He said, yes, that's exactly what's missing. I have a feel that the organization, the hierarchy isn't working the way it does. This helps me clear things up and get back to the top management, the rest of the top management, and say, we need to do something. It's interesting to note that Jones is off to the side, but more telling is the fact that the head of departments, Williams and Taylor, they are perhaps drinking buddies or whatever. We didn't have that information at the time, but they're off to the side. And so's Stock, who's head of department for production. Now, if we had relied, if Jones had relied purely on the hierarchical chart, he would not have known that coal played a critical role in gluing the organization together. This is something that Professor Lyndon Johnson, right? What's his name? I've forgotten. This is what he spoke of 2 weeks ago. If you have not watched his particular sharing, I do suggest that you actually observe that. I think it is one of the best explanations of the basic structures in social networks that allows us to actually go further, go deeper. So here, in a sense, coal is central. Let me unzoom. So imagine now that with this information of an understanding that within this particular organization, social capital accrues to coal. She has the right combination of know-how, know-who, and soft skills. Yes. Or rather, in research parlance, is called relational skills. So this makes something that's invisible suddenly visible, and most importantly, measurable. And as the saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. So this is one of the reasons why I am a big believer in the value of social capital. And I really look forward to your questions and thoughts after I share the case studies that I've got. Yes. By the way, we tried to actually talk about social capital in the region, in Malaysia, in Brunei, and whatever you didn't get too far until we used this phrase. We trademarked it as cableability because in Malaysia, the phrase cables implies your social networks. But there's a lot of dark connotation with that particular phrase. We thought to actually put a different spin on it. We say cableability. And that usually gets the attention of potential clients in the Southeast Asian region. We haven't been to the Philippines though. Perhaps it'll be good to have a chat with Raymond and figure out, how do we actually go about deal with this? So moving on, some of the uses of what we call social capital data analytics is to find out, for example, basically who is central and who's disconnected within the organization. We can then ask the question, why? Of course, that takes us deeper into the overall social capital elements and amalgamating those particular elements. We can actually ask or answer the question, what type of staff is best suited for my organization for particular functions? And that is one of the case studies we'll share in a bit. We can find out how the project teams are actually communicating, because we know for a fact hierarchies only capture lines of reporting. It doesn't really capture the lines of actual communication or indeed actual trust. It can help, or rather, we've used it to answer the question, are our people really innovative or just good at operations? Which, to be fair, is one of the key drivers of economy, especially here in Malaysia. I can be upfront with you. For your information, in the past year or so, I've had the opportunity of becoming an associate of Malaysia's Productivity Corporation. And one of the things we saw was the fact that Malaysians are very, very good at operations, and the social capital justifies that. When it comes to innovation, it doesn't say so. We can use social capital data analytics to determine if there's too little or too much trust. As you can imagine, if you don't have enough trust, things don't really run. If you have too much trust, we run the risk of having opportunists taking, well, as the name suggests, taking opportunity. We might have no one actually doing a proper oversight, due diligence. We can even use social capital data analytics to identify what are the major steps or elements needed to make members more productive. And indeed, in the last month or so, we've been using social capital data analytics output to help figure out who are driving or retarding ESG initiatives. ESG standing for environment, social, and governance. This new approach that a lot of organizations have to adopt in order to get long story short, in Malaysia, if you don't have an ESG reporting and you are a publicly traded firm, you will be kicked out of the BOSO. That's how far they are taking ESG compliance in Malaysia. And I believe something similar is happening around the world. So I sincerely believe social capital can play a major role here. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to skip over this slide first because I would like to give you an overview of the case studies I will share today. We'll be talking about how social capital data analytic output was used to manage innovation. I'll be sharing a bit about how social capital output was used to determine whether certain people's psychometrics are suited for leadership, or indeed whether they are leaders. And finally, taking a look at who are the key ESG personnel within an organization. So backtracking a bit, we've used social capital data analytics for various applications. We've used it for staff selection, for aerospace firms. It's amazing how accurate it is. It's just amazing. Or perhaps if I can put it this way, it's amazing how much they love it because they have never seen anything like it before. Traditional HR looks at individuals, as mentioned in the first slide I shared earlier, but not really how they come together. That's social capital, ladies and gentlemen. I'm getting goosebumps, to be perfectly frank. I don't think you can see it, but I'm getting goosebumps. And I'm not quite sure whether whether the word social capital does that for you, Tristan, but I'm sure it does something to you. Project management, we've used it for. We've used it for, well, we haven't used it for voter management, but there is a case study out there by Washington Post that shows how Trump won the 2016 elections. I'll just post a link later on. So moving on from here, the first case. Oh, by the way, these are some of the organizations, both international and Malaysian, that have leverage on our services. This includes CSIRO in Australia, Ground Probe over in Brisbane. I'm not quite sure whether they are still where they are. They used to be in West End in Brisbane. I think they've moved to a location further north. We've had Petronas, we've had Siemens, we've had Intel. As a matter of fact, Intel is our biggest client at this juncture. And it's interesting that they really see social capital as a way to help deal with their sociology and technology to help recover their position as the world number one. Perhaps you're aware of it, perhaps you're not. AMD is really kicking their backside all over the place. So moving on, the first example, talking about whether you have the right social capital for innovation management. What you see on screen is how we use social capital to measure the quality of the networks. So you can imagine it's not just the networks, it's the other elements related to it to determine whether that organization has the right social capital for the different stages of the innovation value chain, the IVC. Just a quick recap. Innovation value chain, as defined by the OECD, they've broken it up into several stages. So that's the creativity stage, and that's the implementation stage. So the question is, do you have the right kind of social capital for those different stages? Because research have indicated that you need different qualities. So I'll just get right to the final output. I'll skip over that and show you this particular output. These are internal idea generation networks of an organization. This organization is based in Australia. And at the end of the day, we showcase to them that good idea generation, or rather the creative part of the innovation value chain, will be had if you have isolated clusters. Now, that runs counter to intuition, because most of the time we always imagine that, hey, if we want high performance, we've got to be highly connected. This organization showcased the fact that because they are not connected, because the idea generation networks are isolated, they generate fresh perspectives. If they were connected, they would have probably arrived at similar ideas because of levels of trust, levels of information that's flowing from one cluster to the next. So by keeping these clusters separate, by managing the trust with it, because they actually actively manage the trust within these particular clusters. So the relational element, which is one of the elements of social capital, they're able to keep these clusters separate and generate the fresh perspectives in order to become, at the time, the world number one in their field. They are based in Australia. That's idea generation. When it comes to idea implementation or realization, these are the kind of networks that's most productive in order to coordinate action throughout the organization, as you can imagine. So this is diametrically opposite to what good idea generation networks ought to look like. And this has been related to the organization's performance and success, especially in the export field. This particular slide is meant to remind me what they are. So moving on from that particular case study, the second case study talks about psychometrics towards leadership. They wanted to know let me illustrate this first before we go any further. What you see on screen is one of the many psychometric models that's available out there. So psychometric means how we measure personalities. And the DISC model is one of the earliest ones. If I'm not mistaken, it was originally devised back in the 1920s. Essentially, it describes that human beings, their psychology or their personalities are made up of 4 distinct types, whether they are dominant, the one in red, top right corner, whether they are influential, whether they are popular, or they prefer to become popular, which makes up the yellow quadrant in the lower right quadrant, whether they are conscientious, whether they are detailed, whether they're very particular, or whether by the book, and that is made up by that blue quadrant, the top left corner, and whether they are steady, that makes up the green quadrant, the one in the lower left quadrant. So in this organization, which is a multinational, I think perhaps I can actually say this is an American-based multinational. It operates, let me see, let me make sure I get this right. If I'm not mistaken, at this juncture, about 10 sites across the globe. There's an assumption that leaders are those who have dominant personalities. And, logically, yes, that makes sense. Leaders need to be dominant. They need to actually perhaps even bulldoze everybody else. They need to be. But they had an inkling that that isn't the case within the organization. So they actually engaged us to actually help answer that question. Are dominant people the dominant leaders within the organization? And when we did measure their relational, their cognitive, and their structures, this is what we discovered. There will be 3 groups that I actually share. We were allowed to share these 3 groups. The rest, we can't. We've de-identified everybody. And what you see here are social networks, but they have been weighted with the elements of social capital. And you see here that there are every rounded square represents a particular person. Let me zoom in so you can actually see. There we go. Every rounded square represents a particular person within this particular subdivision. Their size indicates the social weight within the organization. Once we've actually collated the other social capital elements that are relevant for leadership, we had to actually do that as part of statistical analysis. And once we did that, we could filter out the connections that were noise. That's noise in referral to leadership. So we see these networks. We see those who are disconnected. We see those who are very well connected. We see those with relatively large weight designated by the size. Yes. And we are able to clean out the networks that don't really add value to leadership. So this is group A. This is group B. And this is group C. By the way, the colors denote their D, I, S, or C propensities, whether they tend to be dominant, they tend to be influential, they tend to be steady or conscientious. And we answered the question that, hey, guess what? Your nuances are right. Within your organization, the dominant people are not the dominant leaders. They're not. You are made up, or rather, your leaders are made up of people who are other than dominant. Both, I'm sorry if I'm overusing the word dominant. I'm struggling to think of another word for it. Predominantly, the leaders are not. The leaders are either steady in green or C, conscientious. I mean, we have a spattering of dominant leaders, but they don't make up a majority within this organization. Again, as I said, these are the three groups that I'm allowed to share. We actually did it across, if I'm not mistaken, about 20 groups. So across the board, we found that, hey, in your organization, your social capital says the D people are not the leaders, which makes sense to them because they are a technically driven organization, and having D people lead may be detrimental because they were trying to answer the question, should they keep hiring and promoting the D people? Because the general nuance on the ground is these people, they can't lead. This social capital data output justifies those nuances, or rather gives meaning to those nuances. So instead of having everything ephemeral, up in the air, based on just feelings, you got hard data. So it's a data-driven approach. So the three groups makes up the case study relevant to answering the question, hey, our leaders all made up of just one dominant psychometric type. I haven't shared with you the one based on the ocean psychometric model. That's even more interesting, but I think, we do have a limited time. Perhaps we can have a separate engagement for that. I will have a follow-up discussion with Dr. Claridge on that. So that's the second case study. And the third case study, this is the latest, talking about ESG drivers within organizations. So a particular organization, this is a local Malaysian organization that's struggling with ESG initiatives. They keep trying to roll them out, but everything falls to bits. And the group CEO had a feel that there were people who were central to not only push the initiatives, but perhaps retard them. That's what they asked us to do. So what we did was actually help this organization measure what we call the backbone and the coordination networks. Now, if you refer to Professor Johnson's session 2 weeks ago, that's available on YouTube, he talks about some of these structures, the ones that really push coordination and the ones that retard coordination. So by combining all this information onto one dashboard, we suddenly can tell, ta-da, it looks like a mess, but this is after everything's been cleaned up. We can then see the connections and the social capital weights between the staff in the organization. Just quickly, we have three divisions here, hence the different colors. Let me zoom in. We have the yellow division, which is made up of those in agriculture. We have the red division, which is made up of the group's management. And we have the blue division, which is made up of those in the hospitality arm of this particular group. Now, so we clean up the noise that designates the total connections between the people. And we focused on the links with the highest levels of coordination and trust. Now, when I say trust, trust is made up of multiple elements. So we had to actually, what's the best word to actually leverage on that? I'm struggling for words here, but essentially add up everything. Some isn't the best word here, but perhaps we can have a separate session for me to actually explain deeper about the technicalities behind it. But that's what we did to show us that there is a central cluster, for example, in the agriculture arm. There is a central cluster, but they have a lot of disconnected, I didn't say disgruntled here. So they have 1, 2, and 3 clusters. Now, initially, we thought that these clusters were made up of geographically distant teams. I mean, they are in plantation, until we discovered that they were not. They were not geographically separated. They were separated by another function. Yes. Cut long story short, those who actually use technology and those who don't. And we shared that with the top management. Hey, your agricultural team, they are clustered around the use of technology or the lack of technology. And if you want to get them connected, maybe you need to standardize on this. And that jury is still out whether they've opted for our recommendation. But the point I'm trying to make is the social capital maps suddenly bring to life, makes things visible what was before probably just based on your gut feel. And it's very, very, to a certain extent, confronting for some people who did not expect them to be found not playing a critical role within the organization. You can imagine. I'm not quite sure if you're familiar with the Malaysian work culture, but I can tell you, if somebody who's paid a lot of money is suddenly being told that, hey, you're worth nothing, oh, they will get really, really angry. But the data tells the whole story. So moving on to the hospitality group, we also found several clusters, 2 clusters as a matter of fact, and a lot of people who aren't connected to these particular clusters. But what's more worrying was the fact that we found that the people in the hospitality cluster, remember they are people in the group, they were not even connected to the management. That brings a lot of alarm bells, but also explains perhaps why the ESG initiatives failed, because there was no connectivity between the instructions given out by the top management and the people who were supposed to actually execute them. You can see these particular the gap here. So they asked us, the client asked us to actually recommend some interventions. What can we do? So first, we actually identified those who are disconnected. By the way, what you see on screen right here is actually the lower valued links or ties between the people, between the staff. Notice even with this particular information mapped onto it, we see those who are disconnected. So first thing first, hey, these people are salaried. We need to figure out what exactly is driving them away from the organization. There must be something. What keeps the rest of them together? And as I mentioned, as I alluded to earlier, it's actually the use of technology or the lack of use of technology. Let me color that slightly. For the agricultural division, a lot of them were embarking on the use of drones to actually do spraying and whatever. But there were those who were given the funds to use drones but opted not to. They use those the funds to keep doing what they've been doing all this while, engage in low value laborers and actually do, for example, crop spraying, even pesticide spraying, land remedial, sorry, not remedial, land remedial activities and whatever. So those are the reasons why within the yellow group, there is a big disparity between the clusters. Then we identify those isolates, because that way we can actually inform the client, okay, these are the people you need to do something about. Center for team building. And the next slide explains some of the interventions that we recommended. Oh, by the way, the text here is quite inaccurate. The blue division, the hospitality division, is the high value business unit where there are high margins. And the fact that they are not connecting to the top management means something is rotten. Something isn't quite right, which also explains why the initiatives fail. So some of the interventions we recommended include checking the data on the 22 disconnect staff and perhaps even recommend what's known here in Malaysia as the VSS, in other words, voluntary separation scheme. If staff have been identified not to really add value to the organization, and that is validated by additional data collection, perhaps that is the way forward for these. This is the way the networks, the social capital networks look like afterwards, after the interventions. 14 staff were retrenched. 8 were sent for training or rather retraining. The organization made savings to the tune of about 30,000 ringgit a month. That's about 10,000 Aussie dollars a month. However, most importantly, their performance, their financial performance improved over time. And not only that, which isn't actually outlined here, their morale improved. Now, in a lot of organizations, it's rare to hear that, hey, you're making more money. At the same time, everybody's happier. Most of the time, it's, yeah, we're making more money, but, we had to lose people. So that sucks, at least in where I live. So to actually have a way forward to be able to eat your cake, sorry, have your cake and eat it as well. Is that the right English adage? Correct me if I'm wrong after this. Yes, you can have your cake and eat it too. Yes, that's the phrase. Have your cake and eat it too. It's possible, but it's only possible with the precision insights that social capital enables. And again, I want to actually backtrack a bit and state that the reason why we adopted Nahapiet and Ghoshal definition was that it's the one that a lot of industries can get their heads around. It makes it easier for them to understand. It makes it easy for them to justify that to the top management. Hey, we need this tool because the level of precision, as opposed to perhaps during World War II, we had carpet bombing where you try traditional methods. You send everybody for training, you send everybody for team building. You have absolutely no idea who has social capital within the organization and who has negative social capital. This approach, so far in the past 3 years that we've been operating, has added a lot of value to the clients that we saw. We are hoping that these insights can help everybody who is here, as well as those who are viewing this, to further take social capital to higher heights. There's a lot that we can learn, and there's a lot that I have learned from the previous International Social Capital Association sessions that we've been able to actually integrate into our tool. And we look forward to actually hearing your thoughts, your inputs, your questions, gaps that you actually see, so that we can further improve this, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that's essentially it. Not quite sure how we're doing for time. It's 4:44. Let me just quickly share with you this output, or rather this extract from the Washington Post that tried to answer the question, how on earth did Trump win the 2016 elections? And indeed, how were they so close in the last elections? Imagine we have 14 people that we need to actually get their votes for. Blues and oranges representing the Democrats and the Republicans. Perhaps the question that's asked is, what color caps or color is trendy? That euphemism for whether they'll vote for Trump or not. So if you look at pure democracy, or for some people they say democracy, hey, based on this, surely orange will win. They make up the majority, overwhelming majority, as a matter of fact. But guess what? It's only when you start looking at the sociology behind this, the anthropology, the social drivers behind this, only then you'll see that, hey, those in orange aren't really talking to each other. Perhaps, there's a level of not discontent, but thinking that, hey, everything will be fine. We make up the majority. Yes, a case in point would be Brexit, but I don't have the data for Brexit. I have the data for this. We can then see the fact that those in blue are central within the yellows or oranges networks. These are people who potentially can change the actions of those in blue, as you see the animation plays. So if that's the case, if we can analyze and figure out who are central within these networks, again, this is the know who, we'll end up with a diagram that looks like this. Now, once we figure out who are central within those networks, we can then focus resources, or rather, that's what Trump's teams did. They looked at who are central and focused their resources at building social capital through these central people. So rather than try to convince 14 people to vote blue, they just had to convince 3 and leverage their resources on that. And in these times of scarce resources or limited resources, I mean, heck, even Jeff Bezos have got a finite amount of money. How much was he worth again? 100 billion these days? Not quite sure whether that is as close as you can get to infinite. But we all have finite resources. This kind of precise approach that the social capital lens allows us to actually achieve or look at helps us decide actively where we should actually put our money at or resources. Now, we can go further and actually even put numbers, the social, or rather the centrality. Now, that's a social network concept, centrality, to justify why we put resources on the ones in blue. Let me zoom in and show you that there are centrality numbers associated with each of the 14 here. There we go. We've got those with 0. We've got somebody with a huge, relatively high value, 40.82. We can always normalize this actually to simplify calculations and presentations. And based on that, that's what the Trump team did. They focused on the ones in blue and made sure that these people had resources to convince the ones in orange vote Trump. Again, of course, that's a simplified version of the story. You can access that. You can actually look it up in Google, the Washington Post article on why Trump won in 2016. I've got a number of other case studies here in these slides, but looking at the time, perhaps this would be enough to actually kickstart a discussion with the group. Thank you so much, Tristan. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rahmat. A fascinating discussion. I might just add that as well about the using social capital to convince people of anything you want to convince them of. If we follow Lyndon Robertson's theory of cheap social capital, not only were the Republicans able to leverage social capital, they're actually able to do it very cheaply through the use of cheap social capital to do that. And so it further enabled them to have a big impact and do so at a very low cost in terms of the amount of effort that was actually effort and therefore money that was required to be able to do it. So we'll open it up for questions and discussion from anyone who has any questions. Feel free to post something in the chat if you are not in a position to unmute yourself. Or simply raise your hand. You'll find that under the reactions button within Zoom. And once you raise your hand, I'll be able to call upon you to unmute yourself and you'll be able to ask your question. So we have Raymond. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Rahmat. Interesting, very interesting presentation. Very new to me. I'm also new to social capital. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wondering about the relationship between the leadership profile and connectedness. Is it necessarily the fact that those who are connected have the leadership qualities that you're looking for, or is it what you want to do in order to bring about a better social network configuration to improve performance of the organization? In other words, is there an ideal type of leadership quality that should be in place so that we can build a configuration of the social network, social capital, and get the organization going
Thanks for the question there, Raymond. If I may paraphrase, so you're asking whether there is a, for example, the type of leader structure, the type of leaders who can actually. What we discovered is that because each organization's culture is different, there isn't a set type of leader or leadership structure that will actually lead to success. We need to understand the culture of the organization. Having said that, the analytical approach is always to create what's known as name-generated questions. In other words, simply put, we ask them to answer the question, hey, who do you go to for leadership? Which type of leadership? Because there are differing leadership models out there. There's the 4-type directive leadership, collaborative leadership model. There's the 5-type leadership model. Whichever leadership model that you actually opt for, we can actually use the tool to determine what kind of leadership is really prevalent within the organization and whether that is directly related to the current performance of the organization. This is where social capital comes into its own. If you can actually use the map the way it does, because you can map the trajectory of the networks as it evolves over time with the organization's actual performance. Then you can answer the question, hey, for our organization, this is the network structure that will lead to success. The previous structures, nope, they're causing us a lot of trouble. So being able to answer that question adds a lot of value. Adds a lot of value. I hope that helps explain the question. Yeah. There's no single set. We have to look at the organization's basic culture. That makes in social capital very useful in different conditions. In other words, we don't need to lead a Filipino organization using an American model or a Malaysian model or Australian model, whatever. It can be led using a Filipino model. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a question that
Thank
I'm
you.
asked frequently is whether these models of social capital are applicable to different cultures. And my response typically is that, well, humans need to be connected in order to achieve things together. And so while there's a lot of cultural specifics about that, the fundamentals don't change. And so we do need to pay attention to context, but the fundamental ideas are the same regardless of what culture we're applying social capital to. So I'm also curious, Rahmat, you mentioned—
I have a question.
Oh, sorry, I'll just finish this thought first, and we'll come to you in a moment. You mentioned that you use the Nahapiet and Ghoshal definition. So is that the one that is the actual and potential resources embedded in more or less institutionalized networks? Is that, or do you more mean that you follow Nahapiet and Ghoshal in terms of the 3 dimensions?
Actually, thank you for the question there, Tristan. So which definition is being used here? Actually, it's a combination of both. The particular approach we adopt allows us to measure the 3 elements. I'm struggling with the words, but you know how it is that you have prerequisites before you make a decision to do something. For example, in trust, you want to measure somebody's trustworthiness. So the answers the question, can I trust this person? First, before you ask the question, am I trusting this person based on my actions? When you actually are able to discern between the two, as Nahapiet and Ghoshal's earlier definition states, then you can figure out that, hey, yes, these are the people that we want to collaborate with because they have showcased either to us or to others around them through the track records that they are trustworthy. They actually help us reduce risk before we actually put trust in them. A lot of organizations and indeed people have mixed up the two, which is why I found that, hey, a combination of the 2 models is really helpful. If you just focus on one, it muddles things up and it's not helpful to our clients at all. It makes things worse. Yes.
Yeah.
I hope that helps clarify things.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off a moment ago, Zhao. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Phil Tang. So thank you very good lecture. So my question is, where is from the value of social capital. Where from the value of social capital. And this question is either people of structure who according to other people power. This maybe this is oriented thinking. RENTSEEK. It's oriented thinking. So maybe in the old time, the information is the value. Information is the value. So somebody, for example, broker or beautiful girls, they like to butterfly from people to people. Maybe they have information, have some maybe the communication to each other and translate this information to value. Okay, this he make money or they make money from this information and take some goods and service for these people. But today, the network lower this or velocity and lower the cost of communication. So information is low value for everybody. So in here, my question is, where of the value of social capital? Maybe if this standard of structure who, maybe it will think some power as a power to take it as a social capital. Yeah. So of course, in some country, in democratic country, maybe any power have been supervised by people, by social media, by everybody, by every institution. But non-democratic country, there is no supervisor, no people to control, and no other council to control. So in here, the power have a value, and for this government official have a social capital, have a higher social capital. Maybe, in my opinion, this social capital is not a good capital for the society, but only for the owner of social capital. Okay, so in the last scenario, or in the last maybe last time, I have a viewpoint about it. Social capital may have a low level and high level. So low level social capital only for entrepreneur or individual or for this general people. But in high level of social capital, we will research that the society how to communicate each other in this network and increase the society improving or better society in social capital. Okay, so this network not only for people, for general people, but also for everybody, for every society. Maybe it's a good tool to increase the democratic type in a non-democratic country. This is my question. Can you follow me?
Thank you for the question. How do I address you, Mr. To?
Yeah, To.
Okay, lovely. To. So the question, if I allow me to paraphrase it, so your question essentially is, what makes good social capital?
Yeah.
Because we keep saying, that's an interesting bit, because I came across by accident, believe it or not, a paper back in 2009 by Bourdieu and Costello. They were researchers of trust in automotive industries. They were intrigued by the case study on the Renault Espace. So the Renault Espace was acknowledged as one of the first MPVs in the world. Actually, there were earlier versions, but Apparently, Renault got it right the first time. But interestingly enough, when they wrote about it, they saw the team that was brought together to develop this particular vehicle were made up of van designers, lorry designers, and Formula One chassis designers and engineers. How can they actually collaborate? It makes absolutely no sense. Yes, but guess what? Through a lot of trials, tribulations,
Yeah.
arguments, they were able to actually come up with the best output. As a matter of fact, the Renault Espace's production rate had to be ramped up 6 times in order to meet demand, which is great. Now, when it came to them developing the second version, second generation, the CEO went on record saying, you know what, we had a lot of problems at the start, but we've been able to iron these out. We have harmony and whatever. Guess what? The second generation was a flop. Why? So it made no sense to them. They would think, everybody thought at the time that, hey, greater trust, greater interlinking, greater communication, greater social capital, it should lead to better performance. What they discovered, and something that Portes alluded to in 1998, is that there is a sweet spot for elements of social capital. And indeed, things like trust and whatever, in which you have optimal performance. The moment you go beyond that sweet spot, for example, if you have too much trust, the traditional thinking at, hey, if we have greater social capital, our performance will improve. No. What they discovered was that there is that inverse U shape. So
but
leading back to social capital.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, so leading back to social capital. We have to actually, so just quickly, so we have to actually do additional research to find out what characterizes that sweet spot. Interestingly enough, I just got back from Intel yesterday, where they asked that particular question. It's unfortunately, I'm not able to share that yet. I'm hoping to actually, get everything cleared up, the NDA, so that I can actually share it with everybody here. I think the moment I share that, everybody, I'm excited about those particular findings, because I think it's the first time somebody's found that, and I hope this particular sharing will inspire the rest of you to go either deeper into research or into industry application and share. Hey, Rahmat, guess what? This is what we found. Yes. So, I mean, in a sense, the answer to that question is we don't quite know yet, but we are beginning to see where it goes and how do we measure that sweet spot.
Perhaps another way to think about social capital, and I use this when I'm speaking with industry because I find that it's quite easy for people to understand, is that social capital can mobilize and enhance and transform other forms of capital. In industry, we spend a lot of money on human capital. We employ a lot of people. We want to be able to mobilize that, enhance it, transform that human capital in a way that can add value. Same with physical capital, plants and equipment and so forth. Well, social capital allows us to be able to enhance, to mobilize, to transform that capital through the social relationships that we have. So this is one way of thinking about it. Human capital is the things that you can do, but social capital is the things you can do together. And we all know that doing things together, we can do far more than we can do alone. So this speaks to what social capital can do, but with that understanding, we can also appreciate that it can be used for good purposes and also for not so good purposes. Corruption or elite capture is effectively that mobilization of different forms of capital, but it's done so in a way that allows it to be captured by individuals in a corrupt way. So it is the same types of processes. It's the existence of connections and trust and goodwill and so forth amongst certain people in certain ways that allows some less desirable outcomes to occur. So I think that, however we're deploying social capital, we do need to be able to understand and appreciate the positive and the negative outcomes that can occur. I think what Rahmat has been primarily talking about in this context is within an organization where there is a pretty well-established shared goal to pursue the interests of the organization moving forward. And so within that context, then we tend to see people's efforts aligning more closely towards that goal. Not to say that it always does, because you still tend to find some individuals who may undermine that collective goal and pursue self-interest above the interests of the organization.
Yeah.
But even so, that's within an organization is a context where there tends to be less of that kind of individual elite capture, less of the types of corruption and so forth that would otherwise occur perhaps across different social groupings or within society overall. So that's just my perspective on that issue. Did you have a follow-up on that one?
Yes.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So maybe my question is, so why some entrepreneur will invite some retired government officer into his team and increase their social capital, and to maybe to do some cooperate with the government, and it's easier to do something for government and maybe get some fund from government. Okay, this is a very general phenomenon in China. Okay, this is the first thing. And the second thing is, maybe I have investigated some entrepreneur, and they will take some time to be contacted with the government official, and maybe they will take some social position in government. Maybe this is the increase their social capital, but they will lose some time to increase their capability of management. So this is the two hand. One hand is increase their social capital, and the other hand is decrease their capability of management. So how to balance this social capital and management capability? The second question, and the third question. So I have found some maybe in China, not in China, in the world, how to understand the believe or the trust, trust, how to believe, trust, understand trust. If we trust each other in constant guarantee, or the blood, 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 or family, or like family, and all the other country, we believe each other or trust according to the rule or the meta rule. See, this is the separate two things. One is obeyed the blood, maybe your grandfather, your father, and your son. And so this is the trust. Okay. So, and the other country, maybe I obey the rule, the law. This of course we this year. So these two countries, or there's two kinds of country, maybe the social capital is have a different level, different quality, and different maybe different social influence, different social influence. That's my question. Yeah. So my question is, maybe the keywords social capital is the same sorts, but in different countries, maybe there have a different applied surrounding, and have a different characteristic. Yeah, of course, maybe there have a different nature. Yes, that's what.
Thanks for
that's my question for us. Okay.
Thank you for the question, Seto. So two questions there. Question one is, how do you actually strike a balance between the social, the value that you get from the social connections and your management capabilities? Yes. I mean, when you explain that, you sound like you're talking about Malaysian businesses, right? I guess across the board, we have that particular issue to a certain extent, or what have you. Yeah. So that particular issue. And the second question being, hey, different countries, different scenarios, different elements, different characteristics.
Yeah.
How can we actually find a standard? And this is one of the reasons why I find that the Nahapiet and Ghoshal's definition really helps, because it really talks to multiple organizations. Allow me to answer the second question first then.
Yeah.
Because Nahapiet and Ghoshal did actually specify exact elements of relational,
Yeah.
structural, and indeed cognitive elements,
Mm.
it leaves it to us to actually look at, okay, what tools can we actually put together to actually improve or rather help measure the agglomeration of the values of social capital. Yes. And because of that, one approach that we can adopt is what's known as let me make sure I get this mathematical model right. Multiple regression quadratic procedure, MRQP. Now, what exactly is MRQP in a nutshell? MRQP is, in essence, instead of the traditional statistical models available out there, it actually looks at the multiplicity of social relationships, because with social relationships, we cannot assume that different items are totally independent of each other. If I know B and I know C, there's a high probability that B and C know each other. If not, I'm going to introduce them. This is definitely based on Professor Lyndon Robinson's explanation 2 weeks ago. Because of the interconnection, this mathematical model really helps to actually tease out those particular differences and similarities. And if we use that particular approach, we can, at the end of the day, carry out statistical analysis to figure out, hey, out of these characteristics in country A, these are the ones that matter to lead to social capital. In another country, which perhaps is a lot more individualistic, has less power distance. Malaysia has been acknowledged as one country with the greatest power distance, hence capability. Yes, and I will lead this to the answer to the first question. Because of that, we can see that, hey, country A or organization A's driving factors are distinctively different. Here are the statistics, the R squared, that can actually help us justify. And because of that, if you have limited resources, instead of having to focus like 20 possible characteristics or drivers of social capital, you can just focus on the ones that drive the top 80%. And it simplifies our role, perhaps as policymakers, as executors, the other words, or any particular stakeholder within the organization, because it helps us decide, hey, as a policymaker, these are the factors, characteristics that matter to me. I leverage on these to increase my social capital. Well, by the way, let's measure the value of social capital to know that, are we going over or beyond the sweet spot? Because past that, as Tristan mentioned, we start seeing corruption happening, no due diligence, which typically leads to that. So now allow me to use that as a lead on to the answer to question one. Question one, how do we actually strike a balance between the two? If you look at the trust model that was developed by Meyer in 1995, Meyer and what are the other researchers, they actually divided the model into trustworthiness and actual trust. And if we actually measure these separately, we can actually see when a particular organization has put too much focus on the structural, in other words, the know-who, and very little on the cognitive. The moment that's clear-cut, especially if, for example, in a network of an organization that does business, for example, we ask them the question, who do you go to deliver technical work to your clients? The moment we see that network becoming sparser and sparser, that raises flags. That tells you, hey, our organization has been focusing so much on schmoozing the politicians and whatever we forget about delivering to our clients. We are so reliant on others to the point where the probability of us putting focus on taking care of the politicians, again, this happens a lot in Malaysia, I can say that up front, the focus on taking care of those politicians rather than taking care of delivering to our clients, here's the indicator. Let's reverse that. The moment you see that, you can actually take active steps, or indeed you can decide to ignore it, because as Tristan mentioned, just because you build more social capital doesn't necessarily mean it'll lead to positive or good outcomes to people around you.
Thank you.
I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. And if I can just add briefly to that, I've been asked, well, it's good if your employees have a social space to be able to engage in social interaction. That's the primary way to build trust and goodwill, reciprocity, social relationships. So how much time should people have, and how much space should people have to be able to do that? And when you think about the trade-offs that occur, you know, if in an 8-hour workday, if you spend 5 minutes, that sounds pretty good. What if they spent an hour? What if they spent 4 hours? What if they spent the entire workday just simply socializing and interacting and discussing with people in a social sense and never get any work done? So clearly there are trade-offs here to be had between forming those relationships and helping them to be strong and actually going about doing the things that we need to do. But even more than that, because as Rahmat suggested in his presentation, when looking for unique ideas, small groups were very effective because they didn't tend to have the potential downsides of, you know, cognitive lock-in and downward leveling norms and all of these kinds of negative effects that can occur when people are very strongly connected. Negative effects in terms of the generation of new ideas. But when it comes to the realization of those ideas, having a very connected group of people allows for that mobilization of different forms of capital, which allows for those ideas to be realized. You know, if you need to get some guidance from an engineer, well, you need to have that connection in order to bring in that, mobilize that human capital into the realization of that idea. And lots of different specialities and forms of capital need to come in to realize most ideas. So this is where different forms of social capital can play a different role in producing different outcomes, and also that there are clearly trade-offs that occur between the investment that we can put into social capital and the kinds of returns we might expect from it. And it's not simple at all. It's really complex. And it's something that I think we can understand it with the current knowledge, but we need to do more research to understand this better. So we have a question from Raymond, had his hand up, and there's also a question in the chat from Deepak. So we'll get to that next. So Raymond, over to you first.
I'll give the floor for a while to Deepak, so that I'll come later.
Sure, we'll come back to you. So Deepak's question was, my research area is creative process in R&D using social capital, knowledge sharing, and absorptive capacity as the variables. I intend to look at creative process engagement at an individual level rather than organization or team. How can I use social capital here?
Great question there from Deepak. So your dependent variables would be knowledge sharing, absorptive capacity. Oh, was that a question? I heard somebody's voice.
Go ahead, Rahmat. I think it was just somebody was unmuted.
So he have a lot of open his video. Okay, good.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Hello.
Got it.
Go ahead, Rahmat.
Yeah,
I think it's resolved now.
Yeah. All right, lovely. So thank you for the question, Deepak. Now, pertaining to the use of social capital to help you ascertain the creative process. Again, as you can imagine, I am a fan of Nahapiet and Ghoshal because if I can be so blunt, that model really helps our business survive and grow. Because it's something that industries can understand. And a lot of industries, especially those that focus on high value add processes, they need to actually be creative in order to maintain their competitive advantage. So if you look at knowledge sharing and absorptive capacity as the cognitive elements within the social capital framework, you probably have to look at the structure. Indeed, if you choose to adopt Nahapiet and Goshal's model, indeed, you want to actually take a look at the interactions between at the individual level. As I shared earlier, you can see that captures both the individual and the group level, which enables you to create or come up with very precise surgical approaches as interventions. That's what industry wants. They're not interested purely at the organizational level. They are interested at the individual level, or indeed the dyadic level between the two people. And I presume that since you're looking at a creative process engagement, you are looking at the basic level is the dyadic structure. However, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're looking at just purely the individual single person, because if that's the case, they're really looking at the psychological level, which that social psychological interplay can be a bit more complex than just pure social capital. I am not, to be perfectly frank, an expert at that particular field. However, I'm sure that the ISCA can put you in touch with the right people who are much, much better at psychological analyses. However, assuming that you are looking at a dyadic level, then you want to clearly identify what exactly are the levels of knowledge sharing and absorptive capacity of each individual that you're looking at. Perhaps there are scales available out there that helps you capture these particular data sets and help you analyze this. The last time I came across such a paper was by Professor Ashkenazi of University of Queensland Business School. And he was actually looking at emotions. And one of the things that he looked at, or his research team was looking at the effect of emotions on absorptive capacity. I'm sure by now there will be others who published in this, but please take a look at his particular work. Let me just type his UQ Business School. I've forgotten his first name. Ron Ashkenazi, I think. Yeah, but look it up and perhaps we can have a follow-up discussion on that. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So are there any other questions people have? While you're thinking of something, it really strikes me that the problem we still have is communicating the nature and importance of social capital to industry. I think Rahmat's highlighted a few ways that we might be able to do it. I talked about the mobilizing, enhancing, transforming other forms of capital as another way to perhaps communicate that. Another way that I find quite useful is to the nature of social capital is to look at those two core components, that there needs to be connectedness in order for there to be the opportunity and ability to be able to engage in social actions. If people don't know each other, if there aren't those structures and connections, then you can't realize the kinds of benefits and outcomes that might come about. And then, of course, just because you're connected doesn't mean people are going to actually be nice to each other. So you need to have the cognitive or perhaps the predispositions or the trust or the norms or whatever it might be that shape the nature of that action when it does occur. And so breaking it down into those two sort of core components of what social capital is seems to be pretty easy for industry to understand as well. But we need to do better in order to take the academic concepts that we have of social capital and put them into a language that can be easily understood by people in industry. So Raymond, we'll come to you. We've still got about 5 more minutes.
Yes, I was just wondering, you're consulting these companies. How far do you go in terms of, I'm trying to imagine the execution of your recommendations for the organization. So there are power structures that need to be changed, even procedures, right? So that's going to be very messy. Very
yes.
messy. How far do you go in terms of the recommendation? Do you go as far as the procedures to follow, policies to change, and power structures that need to be changed so that you can implement your recommendations?
Absolutely. I can share with you some examples of battle stories where we actually had to pull in external consultants who are familiar, for example, of how do you actually let go of staff. We usually collaborate with other organizations that have the expertise, especially the local expertise. We had to actually support some work by CSIRO, sorry, not CSIRO, one of the Australian firms that had their operations in the United States. A lot of the staff were Mexicans. We had to actually engage companies that spoke Spanish as well as understand the lingo and culture in order to get across. So we usually collaborate with others to help carry out the interventions. We recommend or make the recommendations or the interventions, but a lot of times we collaborate with others to make sure that those interventions bring the desired outcome. Where we don't do it by ourselves, because as you alluded to, we'd probably get our backsides kicked if you did that. I try to make sure that, I can wake up the next day.
Can I have a follow-up question, Tristan?
Yes.
Okay. So my research is focused on innovation ecosystems. I think Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and another country started the technology business incubator business, right? And I think that's way back in 1980. You're familiar with technology business incubators, I assume, right? Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, all of these countries took off, and we are left behind. We don't seem to have figured out why it's failing. So, in terms of your experience, what are the success factors in terms of building these innovation ecosystems so that we can leverage the outputs of research institutions like universities and commercialize them successfully?
Yes, it's a big issue across the board. And to be perfectly frank with you, we do have same issue. Interestingly enough, when I was studying over in Australia, I saw that Australians experience the same issues, but the major difference is that they have the necessary tools to tackle it. Now, one of the problems that I saw or I see happening in at these Malaysian universities is the fact that the same team is tasked with developing, rolling out, as well as marketing the technologies that they were tasked with. If you look at the innovation value chain and our knowledge of sociology behind it, we know for a fact that your structure, in other words, the structural element of the social capital, the cognitive, as well as the relational elements that you need for the creative phase, is distinct from the ones needed for the realization phase. But unfortunately, because the same people are tasked with it, they don't have a fighting chance of restructuring or indeed bringing other people into their organization. So what that means is that they are stuck with the same social capital elements from the start. Well, I wouldn't say till finish, because we have a lot of novel ideas that are stuck, that aren't really extracting a lot of commercial or socio-economical value to the country. In my country, or rather in my mother tongue, we have the word basi. I'm not sure whether it's the same in Tagalog, but basi means the food has gone bad. So the phrase that we tend to coin here in Malaysia is basi. Great ideas, but no takers. Main reason, at least in the universities, is this particular issue of them not having the flexibility. If they had measured their value of social capital, looking at the three elements, then they could have seen that, hey, at the start, yes, we need to actually have great idea generation, structures or whatever but the moment we switch over, we have to reorg. That does not happen. In spite of the fact they have the tools, the tools at their fingertips, but lack of use. I hope the same thing can be avoided in the Philippines or indeed in other countries, because I see those tools being rolled out, at least at UniQuest, the University of Queensland's commercialization arm. I learned a lot over there. That's why I'm keen to actually head back over there, at least even and perhaps just catch up with Tristan, who's there. Yes. So let's see whether we could use those tools to help improve the Filipino ecosystem. I have some working relationship with the De La Salle University.
Hope we can get in touch for my dissertation. That will be my dissertation.
Lovely. Looking forward.
And returning to Rahmat's clusters example, it highlights how different patterns of connections and therefore different norms, different forms of trust and working partnerships can create different kinds of outcomes. Idea generation was more effective in the smaller clusters, but the idea realization was more effective when it was more connected. And then going even further than that into marketing and actual business, startups, there's a lot of different things that can happen there. And social capital is an umbrella idea that encapsulates a lot of different possible processes that might be going on. I once had a conversation with someone who was talking about how he'd measured social capital in his area and found a very high level of social capital by traditional measures, but still the rates of innovation were very, very low. because although social norms may be a component that's measured, we often look at social norms for helping behaviors, reciprocity, trustworthy acts, and so forth. Whereas what about the norms related to taking risks? What about the norms related to pushing the bounds and coming up with brand new ideas and trying them out in risky kinds of ways? You know, that can be normative as well, but we don't necessarily measure those kinds of norms when we measure social capital. And so as an umbrella concept, there's a huge range of possibilities of different kinds of outcomes that can occur within the scope of what social capital is. And so if we can narrow it down and we can identify what it is that we're interested in social capital doing, you know, what outcome we're interested in, then that can allow us to narrow in on the kinds of relationships and connectedness and norms and various beliefs, understandings, and so forth that may generate those specific outcomes rather than the kind of generic way that we often look at and think about social capital.
Thank you very much.
You know, think about this. If you're working in product development, then the kinds of connections and the way in which you structure your connections is going to be very, very different than if you're a real estate agent and you need to know 1,000 people and have all of these weak connections to get access to various opportunities. And so the nature of social capital for every individual perhaps is different to achieve the specific types of ends that they're trying to achieve for the way they live their life and the work that they do. Well, I'm not sure if there's any further questions. We've pretty well run out of time, so we'll need to wrap it up there. Rahmat, as always, we greatly appreciate the effort you've put into this presentation, and we'd love to have you back again in the near future as soon as you have some information that you can present to us. So thanks very much, Rahmat. So in terms of the webinar series, the next one is by Professor Florian Grizel, who's going to be talking about cancelling disputes and how social capital affects arbitration in disputes on Wikipedia. So that's next week. The information's on the website. It was originally going to be back in April, well, back in February, I believe. It had to be rescheduled until next week. So if you've already registered for that, you don't need to re-register again. But I hope to see you all for next week's webinar.
Lovely.